Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 66th episode of the Writ Podcast. And I'm joined today by the CBC's Aaron Wherry. Hey Aaron, how you doing?
Not bad. How are you, Eric?
Good. So I don't have a theme for this particular podcast. It's more of a just what people are talking about these days. And I know you're a good generalist, so I thought you'd be able to tackle them all with me. You were on the Front Burner podcast earlier this week, and you were talking about leadership, races, and how the system has been working lately. I wrote about it a little bit on the Writ as well, how it does feel like a couple of the recent examples are indicating some of the problems with the way that we choose leaders. When you had Danielle Smith, who became the Premier of Alberta, with the support of a very small amount of the UCP caucus and just the support of a few tens of thousands of members. And you have out in BC with the New Democrats, Anjali Appadurai, who was disqualified in what seemed to be a coronation that she was kind of ruining. And it raised a lot of questions about whether the NDP just wanted to go ahead with the leader that the party seemed to want. So is the way that we choose leaders, and I haven't even mentioned what happened in the UK, but is the way that we use leaders, or choose leaders, is that system maybe broken or maybe starting to show some of the strains?
Yeah, I think we're at least seeing the downsides and the potential pitfalls of the system. So the short history lesson is we used to just have leaders chosen by party caucuses, by the MPs, the MLAs, the MPPs who were elected would pick who their leader was going to be, which made a certain amount of sense. And then, progressively, parties have moved to broaden the vote out more and more. So first it was sort of delegated conventions, people elected at the riding association level. Now, then it was party members. Now, in the case of the Liberals, it's kind of wide open at this point. We'll see that, particularly in the next leadership. But I don't know that there's any going back, and I don't know that you'd necessarily want to completely eliminate the voice of members in the process somehow, or the voice of the public at large. There's a strong case to be made for kind of having some of that input and giving party members something to do, but the problem comes when you have the party membership strongly supporting one person who the party caucus doesn't necessarily support. And so the first problem is that's sort of structural, like how long can a leader stay in place if they're not supported by their caucus. But I think you're also seeing in the British case and maybe in the Alberta case is the party membership isn't necessarily going to think about who's most electable, what's the most practical idea, what has the most support within the legislature, within the caucus. They aren't going to necessarily think of things on a very practical level. They're going to think about things in terms of what's exciting, what's interesting, what really speaks to me, even if it doesn't necessarily speak to the broader electorate. And that's going to get you into situations where you're going to get the Alberta Sovereignty Act, or you're going to get Liz Truss's, financial agenda or fiscal agenda. And you have to look at sort of, especially how the situation has gone in the UK, and say how much chaos and trouble could have been prevented if the caucus, the party caucus, had an ability to pick a leader who was maybe more practical and who they knew they could all support.
Also, if it is a governing party, I feel like the bar probably needs to be a little bit higher, right? Because they have the mandate from the last election. They actually have to implement a policy as a government. And if you do have someone coming from the outside, the quote unquote the outside, it is very strange, right? Because if you had a situation like with the BC NDP, where Appadurai could have taken over this party because the BC NDP had allowed its membership to just dwindle to a small enough number that it could be taken over more or less by an outsider with a good organization. This person, Appadurai, would have been sworn in as premier with none of the caucus behind her, with an agenda that was completely different from the one that they'd been elected on. And it just raises all these questions of the MLAs having to accept this person as their new leader. without any mandate at all from the voters. Now, I know that we elect MLAs, we elect MPs, and they're there to make a decision. And if they wanted to, they could not support this person and, bring down their own government, I guess. But it does seem like we have a situation where there's a lot of asymmetry, right? You have mandates from voters, but you have members who get to choose a leader. You have the parliamentary system versus just like a grassroots. It just doesn't seem like these are really well aligned, because you have the situation like we saw with the Conservatives federally, that the MPs can remove a leader that members can put into place. And it just seems like again and again and again, we're going to have these kinds of issues that they don't really align. They don't make sense based on how we understand our elections and democracy to work.
Yeah, and maybe it's interesting that you make the point about, parties in power, because maybe that's the distinction to be made, is parties in power should maybe skip these long leadership races. For one thing, it keeps the government tied up and kind of in suspended animation for weeks and months with, no ability for whoever happens to be sitting in the chair to move forward. But the BC case is a fascinating example, because right now, they're going to have this, the BC NDP is going to have this problem where it seems like they have alienated all of these, either supporters or potential supporters. But if it had gone the other way, they could have had a premier who wasn't supported by the governing caucus. And that would have been even worse. So, maybe, you threw out an idea in the Writ the other day that I thought was pretty good about MPs or MLAs having to support, or a leadership candidate having to have 50% of the caucus supporting them to even stand for nomination. I think that's one potential solution. The other is maybe, governing, when parties are in government, they need to be able to tell their membership, like, look, we're not going to take the next 6 months to see how this turns out and pick a leader. We're just going to have the caucus vote and get on with it. The Reform Act in Canada is kind of a step towards that, in that it at least gives the caucus the power to knock a leader out. It then goes to a wider vote of the membership. But, I just think that anytime you try to graft on sort of non-parliamentary process onto a parliamentary system, you have the potential for things to get weird and things to not work. And, in the UK, that is even worse, because they went through Brexit, and a referendum is definitely not conducive to Parliament. But it does seem like we've now seen the downside of this system. We've probably spent a lot of time, parties have probably spent a lot of time thinking about the upside of this system. We're now kind of seeing the potential problems, and that's, I think parties are going to have to, especially parties in power, are really going to have to think about how they move forward with these things.
Because for me, there's two different issues that I think are important. One is the fact that we might be in an era where it's a bit riskier to have one member, one vote kind of leadership races, because of how easy it is to sign up a lot of people, how you have, that sort of clicktivism, activism kind of thing, where you pay your $15 or whatever it is, you get something in the mail in your inbox, and then you vote, and then you never have any interaction with the party again. You never have to actually meet another party member in any way. At least with the old delegated system, there was a long kind of process. You had to be involved. You had to go to the local meeting to choose your delegates to send to the convention. They had to go. So there was a lot more involvement. And it brings up the questions of, one, whether it's just easier to manipulate and sort of take over parties now. And two, what is a party? What is a party member? If you can just sign up and disappear, is the party the caucus? Is it the organization? Is it the people who volunteer? Is it just the people who paid the $15 to get a membership card? Like, what is a party? So when people say, I have the backing of the party, I can become the leader. Well, what does that mean anymore? I'm not even sure.
Yeah, well, and think about what I suspect everybody's going to end up kind of following the new liberal model, which is, you're not a member, you're a supporter, right? You're not even, you don't get a membership card. You don't have to pay to join. You can just sort of send them your email address and you get to vote. And we'll see how that goes. Especially with the next leadership. And the first time they did it, I guess they haven't really done it under a new system. But once, the next leadership case for them will be an interesting test of that. But the Another kind of example to keep in mind here is the U.S. primary system. And look, I don't think you ever want to go back to the room when the days when a bunch of old dudes in the quote unquote smoky back rooms were picking leaders and picking candidates. But the American primary system has really pushed American politics to the extremes because it rewards kind of extreme appeals, it rewards kind of very emotional appeals, and there's no chance for party elders or the party establishment to kind of rein that system in. And, as much as I talked about this a bit on Front Burner, as much as that system allows for some new voices, constructive new voices to come into politics, I think on the sort of a general total scale, you'd have to say it's been a net negative for them and it's hurting their politics. And so, I don't know that we're in a crisis and, people need to start talking about massive reform, but I do think that we've now, especially with the Britain case, Canadian political parties are going to have to think about how this plays out in the future.
Yeah. And with the primary system, you said how the party kind of, quote unquote gatekeepers can't keep things reasonable. There used to be the theory that the party decides, right? It was a theory in American politics that the party would eventually steer people towards the candidates who were at least acceptable. And in 2016, when Donald Trump was trying to take over the primary, that was one of the arguments that he would never end up winning because the party will decide and they will not go with Donald Trump, they'll go with a Jeb Bush or someone else. So it does seem like Donald Trump's kind of style of populism, which has been adopted by other candidates, not necessarily the policies, but in terms of the style, can co-opt that system pretty easily. And it was almost like that we were just kind of lucky before that it hadn't been ruined in a way. Because there is a lot of things, especially in Canadian parliamentary system, that is based on convention and norms, and a lot of it is based around people playing nice and not trying to break the system. But if we start having more cases of that system being broken because people don't want to follow those norms anymore, then we might start wondering if our system is all that much better than one like the Americans, which a lot of us think is pretty damaged right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, the lesson of the American experience is you can spend a lot of time assuming that politics will default to normal and you won't ever kind of go backwards or into crisis. But if there are loopholes in the system, you have to worry about them. And there's no perfect system, and you're always going to have trade-offs. But there is a moment now to probably reflect on how leaders get chosen in this country and sort of where that could ultimately lead politics, and some of this stuff may get worked out in the wash, right? If Danielle Smith turns out to be a very extreme candidate pushing very unworkable ideas, maybe she loses the next election and the system kind of accounts for whatever problems the leadership race allowed for. But it is the great lesson of the last sort of 6 years is don't take any of this stuff for granted because weaknesses will get exploited sooner or later.
Yeah, some people could argue that the UK example is the system worked, but
right.
it took a little bit.
If that's the system working, I don't know that I want to throw a parade anytime soon.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to move on to another issue. So we had a series of municipal elections taking place in Canada the last couple of weeks. We had BC last week. We had Ontario and Manitoba this week. A big difference between BC and Ontario and Manitoba and a lot of places around the country is that British Columbia does have municipal political parties. Ontario doesn't. I do wonder whether we might want to head down the road of municipal party politics because I wrote about something and I shared it on Twitter recently. There was a study that was done a few years ago. It was testing how people were voting in municipal elections, and it found that if you were a name in the top of the ballot based on your surname, ranked alphabetically, you had like a roughly 5-point advantage over someone in the middle of the pack. That if you're a name buried in a long list of names, you're unlikely to get randomly chosen by people because a lot of people, when they were voting, hadn't researched the candidates in municipal politics and just voted for someone who was near the top, which I think reveals that for a lot of voters in municipal elections, they don't have enough information to know who to vote for. I'll admit, when I voted just earlier this week for here in Ottawa, I had to vote for a school trustee. I hadn't done any research about it, and I didn't know anything about the candidates. That's that's my fault. I was a bad voter, but I still cast a ballot for one of them. It's not a good thing, right? If there was political parties, it helps sort those candidates for voters and help them decide which candidate is the one they're going to vote for. So I wonder if municipal politics could use a little bit more political parties.
I mean, the turnout numbers definitely speak to the idea that something could be changed. I mean, my first feeling and inclination is that the media doesn't cover municipal politics enough and doesn't put enough attention on it. I think sort of the way we cover politics in this country is out of whack, at least the balance of it, in that we cover federal politics like it's the be all and end all. And meanwhile, you've got other significant levels of government that actually, in many ways deliver more services, have more direct impact on people that just don't get the same amount of coverage. So I think
we've actually talked about it before, how the press galleries in a lot of the provincial legislatures are far smaller than at the federal level. And it's not a good thing. There needs to be a lot more of the coverage of provincial politics and municipal politics too. But maybe covering municipal politics would be easier if there were parties to help kind of figure out who some of these candidates were. In Ottawa, we had, I think, about a dozen mayoral candidates. No one's going to be able to do the research into all of them and know how to vote based on that research, because even when you have candidates putting out pamphlets or whatever, no one's often even testing whether what they're saying is true or they're actually going to go for it. It's not like a political party system where just the coverage and just for voter behavior, I think, is a lot easier to just get your head around.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would make a certain amount of sense if you went with established parties. I look at the Vancouver system, and it just seems like there's 37 parties, and they change every couple of weeks, and it's not clear to me what they stand for. And from afar, at least, I mean, maybe it makes more sense to people on the ground, but from afar, it seems incoherent. And if you could somehow, it sounds weird because a lot of people will complain about party politics at the federal and provincial level, but if you could somehow carry the sort of major party brands to the municipal level, which I believe is more or less how it works in the UK, you would maybe get, not only more turnout, but sort of more coherence, and it would make more sense to people in a way, and it may even lead to more media coverage in a way, that if it was sort of in line with the other political systems we have, I mean, I don't know that you'd have to debate whether it would lead to better governance or necessarily or better systems, and maybe it would. There would be some sort of downsides to the system, but you look at the turnout, and even in an election in Ottawa, where in general people vote a lot in Ottawa, like turnout in provincial and federal elections is usually pretty high in Ottawa, and the turnout here I think was like 44%.
And that was good.
Yeah, and that was good. And this was supposedly a very competitive, interesting race in Ottawa, easily the most interesting since I moved here in 2007. So, the fact that people just aren't interested, and the fact that, when you look at the numbers that incumbents pile up, surely based a lot on name recognition, it does make you wonder whether the system needs some kind of adjustment to sort of open it up and make it more coherent for voters. I don't know. You raised the school board trustee. The idea of like political parties and on school boards makes me a bit leery. But I think on the broader level, like I do wonder, like would it not only kind of help voters understand it, but would it generate more interest in it and make it sort of a more accessible, open system in a way? If instead of it sort of just being on name recognition, or in fact whether or not your name is at the top, like your last name is at the top of the alphabet, whether it would actually kind of improve the politics. I think it's an idea. I don't know how you would do it in practice, like whether you would just sort of need that sort of change to happen organically, but it is an interesting idea that again, you're sort of seeing, if the last kind of municipal elections in Ontario are sort of showing you sort of the downsides of where things are, of how things can work, you do kind of wonder whether that's a reform that could kind of move things in the right direction.
There are a lot of people who dislike party politics and think that it would, like, so as you said, I don't know if it actually would improve governance. I know in some of the councils it might maybe make things a bit easier rather than having, having a mayor that has almost like a mandate because they have a caucus behind them sort of thing. Maybe that would be easier. But a lot of people do like having independent politicians that can, move around on things. So, but in terms of just the voting, I feel like it probably would make things easier for people, but then maybe it would make things worse afterwards. I don't know, but I just want someone to help tell me which school board trustee to vote for. Okay, so let's move on to one other thing happening in Ottawa. This is the inquiry by Rouleau on the Emergencies Act and the federal government's imposition of it back during the convoy that was here in Ottawa back in February. I'm curious just because I'm just curious because I haven't actually heard your thoughts on this, but what is your take on how this has been going and what's your take on the inquiry so far?
So, I mean, I think it's still early days to a certain extent, and we'll see as more pieces kind of fall into place what the picture becomes. But my initial sort of takeaway and curiosity is there's this evolving storyline of sort of police officials and police forces saying, maybe the Emergencies Act wasn't necessary. Maybe we could have, actually done this without it. I don't think we necessarily needed it, so on and so forth. But, then I think you have to ask the follow-up question is, well, if you didn't need it, why was Ottawa still under siege? What was the problem that was keeping you from going forward? And that, I kind of wonder whether from the start of this, I've had kind of an inkling that maybe the commission ends up finding that the Emergencies Act didn't perfectly meet the legal threshold for invoking it, that maybe it wasn't absolutely necessary, but that it became kind of de facto necessary because no one was doing anything and no one was taking control of the situation and no one was forcing the issue. And it'll be interesting to see how the commission sort of accounts for that, because I think the Emergencies Act was designed to deal with sort of very extraordinary situations where there just was no way in the existing laws and the existing authorities for someone to deal with it. And I don't think it accounted for sort of just failures of execution and failures of leadership and failures of different jurisdictions to seize the issue. So I kind of wonder if we're headed toward a split decision on that. So that's on kind of the legal issue. On the kind of politics of it, I suspect that the politics of it are almost kind of set to a certain degree. I don't know that if the commission comes back and says, it actually wasn't necessary, I don't know that people are going to go, well, I really am mad at Trudeau for invoking it now. Because I think the public kind of may understand that feeling of like, well, somebody had to do something, and at least it's over now. I do wonder, as we get further and further into this, whether the Conservatives will be able to, and Pierre Poilievre in particular, will be able to avoid having to answer questions about why he supported this convoy in the first place. And, he's made this line of, well, I supported the lawful protesters, not the ones who were doing bad things. And I think the further we get into this, the harder it might get to draw such neat distinctions. And I think that the more this kind of stays in the public realm and the more it's explored about what exactly happened there, I wonder how much longer Pierre Poilievre can sort of avoid answering questions about what happened.
Obviously, when Trudeau himself goes, that'll probably be an important political moment in terms of that whole debate. But it is certainly just it's hard to know going back in time whether it was necessary, right? Because it is a lot of hindsight to say whether it was necessary or not. Because I remember during the convoy itself, there was a lot of Trudeau was getting asked all the time, are you going to invoke the Emergencies Act? Are you going to invoke the Emergencies Act? And then once he did, it was like, why did you invoke the Emergencies Act? There was a political pressure on that side just to do something because no one was, it seemed, doing something. So when you do have the police forces that are saying that, oh, well, we were eventually going to do it. I mean, there is a lot of self-interest on everybody's part, right? For the police forces to say that, no, we did actually have things in hand. We had a plan. We were going to execute it. And for the government to say, well, no, we needed to put this in because you weren't doing it. So it is a lot of, it's hard to know because we don't have an alternative universe where 2 weeks later the act wasn't invoked and what happened? We don't know. So it does seem,
There's a lot of, it seems like there's a lot of like, we were this close to doing something. We were just, the police were just about ready to move in. And again, that would be, that argument is a lot more, I think it would be a lot more persuasive if the convoy had lasted 4 or 5 days. But, it went on for weeks. And there was a lot of, somebody needed to do something, and the Emergencies Act was something. So therefore it became the thing to do. I do think, it will be interesting when Trudeau and the other ministers go on the stand. So we'll see how well they hold up. It'll obviously be a key political moment, but I think it'll also be a real test of how much thinking they did inside, how they thought through the process, and then also how well they can explain what they did and how they thought things through. This government has already stumbled over the question of whether the police advised them to do it. The public safety minister came out and said, we did this on advice. And then the Conservative said, went to police forces and said, well, did you ask for it? And they said, well, no, we didn't ask for it. And that became a storyline for a few weeks. And this government just is not used to talking in much more than sort of broad strokes and platitudes and value statements. And in an inquiry situation, which is pretty close to a judicial situation, I don't know that they're going to be able to do that, or that it'll look good if they do that. And so their ability to explain themselves, I think, is going to be tested in the few weeks ahead.
Yeah, unless something very revelatory comes out, or Trudeau or one of the ministers says something that gets them in trouble. I do wonder whether there is going to be much of a political impact, because I wonder how many people are really all that interested in this anymore, right? Because this was a convoy now that was, how long ago now? 6-7 months ago, maybe even more than that. But the Emergencies Act was invoked. A week later, it was the convoy, the occupation was over. It was revoked, and for most Canadians, it didn't really seem to impact their lives. And it seems like all is well that ends well, right? So I wonder if that will be the general kind of takeaway from this. I'm not sure if there's going to be a huge amount of people that are extremely upset that the civil liberties could have theoretically been infringed upon in the week or two that it was invoked. Because for most people, especially those who didn't live in Ottawa, it really didn't impact their lives.
No, it feels like a very local story, and it feels like a local story in a city that maybe not a lot of Ontarians really relate to or care about. It's considered a kind of a government town and way off in nowhere. But I think you're right. Like, I think Doug Ford's decision to not appear and to refuse a summons is an implicit message. Like, well, no one cares about this. Like, I can not show up, and it's not going to cost me a single seat or a single vote anywhere. And I think that's sort of the implicit message of what he's doing, and that's, I think that underlines your point that, outside of maybe some federal political implications, I don't know that people are hanging on every word of this outside of Ottawa and sort of the press gallery.
Yeah, it's not like the Charbonneau Commission in Quebec or the Gomery Inquiry or these kinds of things where people were, aside from politicos in Ottawa, following their Twitter feeds, I'm not sure how much it's resonating outside. Okay, we'll cover one last topic. We'll do it pretty quickly. The oath to the king, swearing into the king. So in Quebec, obviously, there's been controversy over this when the MNAs are elected from Québec Solidaire and the Parti Québécois were not willing to swear their allegiance to Charles III, the third of his name, and wanting to just swear allegiance to the Constitution of Quebec and the people of Quebec. And it's still a bit of a legal limbo in terms of whether they'll actually get to sit in the National Assembly. The CAQ government there, it seems pretty open to the idea of getting rid of this, but of course, to get rid of it, you need to go to the Assembly to vote, and to go to you have to swear in. Anyway, so in Ottawa, the Bloc Québécois has jumped on this issue, put forward a motion this week about breaking Canada's ties to the monarchy, and the Bloc voted for it. About half the NDP caucus voted for it, and a smattering of other MPs, but it was defeated. But this whole issue, which I know is not a top priority for a lot of people, I still find it a very interesting one, especially because you heard from Kevin Lamoureux, the MP, Liberal MP, more or less challenging Yves-François Blanchet whether he could actually sit in the House, because he had admitted that his oath of allegiance to the monarchy was not sincere. Right. To me, this feels like better, let sleeping dogs lie when it comes to this, and not bring up the possibility that MPs in the House are secret Republicans that are going to, tear down the monarchy from within.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of political gamesmanship and troublemaking going on here, right? Like the Bloc just put that motion on the table to cause problems, and I think Blanchet may have kind of put his foot in his mouth when he said, well, I didn't really mean that oath I swore. I think the Liberals were trying
really shocking, though. I mean, a lot of people, I'm sure, are very surprised.
Thought he was a monarchist. I think Lamoureux and the Liberals were trying to kind of, turn it around and make trouble for the Bloc. I don't know that anybody really wants to go down this rabbit hole, both either the monarchy or the, oath that MPs swear. And so, the Liberals who need to kind of get back on message about what they're doing for the country, I suspect will find a way to let this drop. I do, look, if there is a small sliver of a serious issue here, it's I suspect that we're probably overdue for some kind of amending of the oath. It's not, even though we say the King's name or the Queen's name, it's not a personal, we're not personally pledged to them as individuals. It's already kind of symbolic, and it wouldn't shock me if at some point in the near future, somebody tries to amend that oath that new citizens swear and that MPs swear. I don't think it's going to happen now, and it's definitely not going to happen while the Bloc is asking for it. But I think at the moment it's just sort of, I do, there's probably, I haven't looked at the polls in a while, but like there is probably some appetite for people like who just don't like King Charles and would like to move on from the whole thing. But it's one of those issues like electoral reform, for instance, where people, if you ask them, will state an opinion, but there's maybe, only 2% of the population is going to bed at night worried about it. And so I suspect everyone will find a way to drop this pretty quickly, as much as the Bloc, who, I once referred to them as sort of the troublemakers of Parliament, and some people kind of were like, oh, that's, you're being disrespectful. But I think they would probably admit that they're there to kind of throw a few spanners into the works and cause some problems for the other parties. And I think this is just sort of one way of doing that.
What happens in the National Assembly will probably be pretty important, because if they do get rid of the oath there and replace it with something else, then the fact that you have to swear to sit in the federal parliament in Ottawa, but not in the provincial parliament in Quebec City, would be a little bit of a weird thing. That, in order to be a representative of the people in the federal government, you have to swear allegiance to a monarch that you might consider foreign. And I know a lot of people think, well, it's a Canadian crown, but anyway, they've never buried a Canadian monarch here in Canada. That kind of divide could become kind of awkward to maintain.
Yes.
And we'll see what happens with it. But I do feel like the federal government would like that this goes away as much as possible. Quebec deals with it, and whatever they want to do is fine, and leave us out of it, because this is just, it is an emotional issue. You asked about polls. For a lot of Canadians, as you said, it's not a priority. If it was put to a referendum, they'd probably vote to leave the monarchy, just if, there would be a campaign, and then, maybe that would change some minds. But in Quebec, it's like 70, 80% who would get rid of it, right? So in Quebec, it's a pretty decided issue. In the rest of the country, I think people are pretty divided. But it is, like you said, with electoral reform, the idea is a lot easier than the process. of having to go through it all. And most people would probably just prefer to avoid that if we can. But we'll see we'll see what's going to happen with this, because as you know, the motion was defeated, so that might be it for now. But if Quebec gets rid of the oath, then maybe next time after the next election there'll be some MPs who say, well, we don't want to do it either, and then it becomes something that has to be dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to completely go away. King Charles is going to be king for a while, and he's going to come to Canada, and we're going to have this kind of rolling debate. It will come up more than it did when Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. But it's one of those things where I don't know that it's necessarily like constitutional negotiations where people just don't want to think about it at all. But I think most 98% of voters would say there are a lot of bigger problems to be dealing with right now. So, let's just find something else to talk about.
All right. Well, we don't have anything else to talk about, so we're going to have to end it here. So, all right. Well, thanks a lot, Aaron, and we'll chat again next time.